Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Moeller here to present my paper, Valuing Nature, A History of Instrumentality. And before I begin, I'd just like to say thanks to Coastal Carolina University and the Jackson Family Center for Ethics and Values for putting this whole conference together. I think it'll be a lot of fun seeing the other presentations as well as seeing what people think of my own. And I'll just jump right in. So the main thesis of my paper is that intrinsic value, as it is traditionally thought of, doesn't need to exist and does not exist in order for nature as a whole to be morally considerable. My paper proposes the idea that it is satisfactory to view intrinsic value in regards to nature as nothing more than a glorified version of instrumental value that is and ought to be ascribed to nature by humans due to its long history of usefulness and our long history of appreciation for it. I will argue that looking at instrumental value in this way results in a clearer, simpler, and easier to accept and understand system of value that still results in a view of high respect for the environment. So one of the goals of environmental ethics is to determine why and how we should value nature, and then what types of actions that this value should lead us to do. And there are different ways people try to do this. One of the more common is an anthropocentric view, which states that really all we have to worry about are the concerns of humans and ourselves and other humans, and just we use the resources as we please, only caring about our concerns, and that really the only reason we should protect the environment is to make sure that we have resources in the future and to make sure we have a high quality of resources. Another prominent view is ascribing intrinsic value to nature, and this can come in a variety of ways. Many people define intrinsic value as something opposed to instrumental value. So, like a hammer is instrumentally valuable because it can hammer something, but there are things that people think are valuable even if they aren't instrumentally valuable for anything. And pleasure and sometimes knowledge are two things that are often thought to be like this. A second type of intrinsic value people often talk about is that something can be valuable even if it's not valuable inherently, like pleasure or knowledge, or even not valuable for its instrumental use. Most philosophers agree that humans have this type of value. Even a person that's kind of a rotten guy and might even have negative instrumental value, like taking away from society in some way, still seems to be deserving of some respect and consideration, even though it doesn't have either types of these values that we usually think of. A third type people often talk about is value that does not rely on subjective belief or even the existence of any value at all to judge the value of the thing. And of these three, I am wary of adopting the anthropocentric view because it seems kind of egotistical almost to think that we only have to care about our own concerns, and wantonly using animals and the environment with just our concerns in mind seems kind of wrong to me. It can lead to a lot of actions that seem counterintuitive. But that being said, I also find it hard to accept views that appeal to abstract entities like intrinsic value and say that there is some sort of intrinsic value in nature that makes it morally considerable. Unlike instrumental value, which we can easily observe and it's kind of easy to define as well, intrinsic value usually is kind of too out there for most people to really get on board with, I feel like. And it's like most philosophers have a hard time defining what they mean when they use intrinsic value. As we've seen, there's several different types. And then if it's that hard to define, it's usually even harder to defend. The philosopher D.G. Ritchie once said something similar about when moral and political philosophers talk about rights. This is a quote. He said that when they use rights in their arguments, they're engaging in a rhetorical device for gaining a point without having the trouble of proving it. And I feel like that's kind of the same way environmental ethicists use intrinsic value. You can't really prove it exists, but most people will just kind of agree that it does exist because it sounds intuitive, and I don't know, it's easy to accept even if it's not easy to prove. Also, I disagree with the ways in which most environmental ethicists use intrinsic value in arguing for caring for nature. One of the ways philosophers do this is they choose to completely ignore the instrumental aspects of nature, which seems very strange to me, since there's obviously so many instrumentally valuable parts of nature that we all use, that it seems like it could be a good starting ground for an environmental ethic that most people could kind of jump on board with and agree that it does have instrumental value, so we should value it because of that. So completely ignoring it seems kind of odd to me. A second way some environmental ethicists use intrinsic value is describing the environment as being morally considerable in the same way that humans are morally considerable. And this, while it sounds good, it doesn't seem very intuitive to most people, I don't believe. It's much harder to defend that this type of value exists in nature than it is to defend that it exists in humans, partly because nature is not obviously a singular or tangible entity worthy of ethical concern, while as a human being has concerns and desires and can feel pain and pleasure, and it's just kind of obvious that we owe other humans some respect due to these things. Nature as a whole does not have these desires or abilities to form opinions or have concerns, so it's also not clear that it deserves this type of moral consideration. A third way that many philosophers try to look at the intrinsic value of nature is to say things that, like, we should imagine how nature would be valuable if we didn't exist at all. So completely taking out the anthropocentric idea in it. But this also seems kind of odd to me, because ignoring our relation to nature just seems kind of backwards, when like the thing we're trying to figure out is exactly how we relate to nature and how we should act in response to it and with it, and what types of duties we have to protecting it. So completely taking away the relational aspect of it seems kind of weird. Like, we should acknowledge that we are interacting with nature and emphasize it and try to figure out the best way we should interact with it, not completely ignore that we exist at all. Imagining like some other universe where nature exists and we don't doesn't seem like it can really get us anywhere. So after I realized that I thought this way about value in nature, I realized that I was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because I agreed that we should care about nature because of its instrumentality, but I didn't like the way that many philosophers endorsed that view and the types of conclusions they came to have from that view. But I also felt like intrinsic value was too metaphysical and like hypothetical of an idea for me to really jump on board with. So I couldn't really understand like how to combine the two. But then I started thinking of ways instrumental value could somehow lead to a deeper form of value, and like almost a type of intrinsic value. And I just Googled this idea of intrinsic value, or of instrumental value leading to intrinsic value, and I discovered the paper by Robert Elliott entitled "Instrumental Value in Nature as a Basis for Intrinsic Value of Nature as a Whole." And this is exactly what I was trying to think about, so it was a blessing to find this. And in this paper, he examines a few ways in which instrumental value could lead to something being viewed as intrinsically valuable or of deserving a higher title of value than just instrumental. The first example of that, or the first idea of how this could happen that he had in the paper, is that since nature produces things that have intrinsic value, such as humans and beauty and things like that, that it too must have some intrinsic value. He compares this to Holmes Ralston III's idea of systemic value. Ralston, in his book, Ralston suggests that since nature as a system produces organisms which we value intrinsically, we should therefore value nature intrinsically. And it seems like a good idea and makes a lot of sense, but Eliot realizes that it commits the genetic fallacy of argument, and that fallacy basically states that just because something leads to another thing does not mean that it too like has a characteristic in common with the thing that it leads to. So just because something leads to entities which have intrinsic value, it doesn't mean that it also has intrinsic value. And he gives an example of a hurricane that destroys an area and then like moves on to a lagoon, and through its destruction and power, it actually cleans up the lagoon and leads to a more beautiful and biodiverse area. And obviously, just because the hurricane led to more life around in the lagoon and a more beautiful environment, it's not mandatory that the hurricane has intrinsic value just because it led to things that have intrinsic value. So the idea that a thing's instrumental capability to produce things which have intrinsic value, resulting in it also having intrinsic value, seems to have some problems attached to it. The second probability Elliott examines is whether external properties, internal properties, or both can add value to the entity. And Elliott states that intrinsic value seems to be an internal characteristic, and because of this, it may be true that only other internal characteristics can affect the thing's intrinsic value. And if this is the case, then instrumentality, which seems like an external thing that relies on relations and how is it affected and how it affects other things, may not be able to add to a thing's internal and intrinsic value. But even if instrumental value was an external property, which it kind of seems to be, Elliott thinks that it could still lead to improving a thing's intrinsic value or affecting its intrinsic value. And he gives the example of beauty in trying to defend this idea. He says that the property beauty seems to be an external characteristic, which it's subjective, and it, like instrumentality, it relies on some sort of relation. And if we had a bunch of objects that are beautiful, and then we have one of these objects is obviously the most beautiful, then the fact that it is the most beautiful of its kind tends to lead us to believe that it's more valuable in some way. But while this seems also intuitive, it doesn't seem to me that a thing's external beauty really adds to its intrinsic value in the way that we're trying to determine, or the way that we're trying to analyze. We can imagine many instances where just because a thing's more beautiful, it doesn't follow that it also demands more moral consideration or respect. For example, it seems odd to say that Brad Pitt deserves some extra consideration than I do because he's more handsome, or that a dog deserves more consideration than like a kind of a homeless dog just because it is fluffier, has better grooming, or anything like that. The beauty doesn't seem to really affect the internal intrinsic value of the thing. But while this is true, I feel like instrumentality may still be able to add to the internal value of a thing, even if it is an external an external attribute. And instrumentality, it seems to be different than beauty on a lot of ways, because a thing's instrumentality is not really subjective in the way that beauty is. It's like instrumentality seems to be more universal. What is beautiful varies from culture to culture and person to person, but a hammer, again, is valuable in every culture that needs something to be hammered, and there's no really arguing about it. And I mean, you could say, some may say that this isn't really true because there's like medicine is only, there's certain medicines that only help people of a certain gender or race, and they're only instrumentally valuable to those people. So it's not really, all things don't necessarily have universal instrumentality. But this argument for medicine doesn't really prove anything, because everyone that needed everyone that is actually in the condition that needs that medicine, the medicine is still instrumentally valuable to them. And it's the same as if I don't have to hammer something, then I don't really need a hammer, but I still understand that the hammer is instrumentally valuable for hammering something. So that critique doesn't really accomplish too much, I don't believe. It still seems that the instrumentality of a thing is kind of universal and maybe even an internal characteristic of the object. Like, it seems like the ability of a hammer to hammer is somehow like internal to the nature of the hammer in some ways. It's in the essence of the hammer to be able to hammer things. And I think it's true for this type of internal characteristic is true of all things that have instrumental value. Nature seems to be internally instrumentally valuable in producing great, beautiful environments and animals and humans as well. And this instrumentality, I believe, is something that everyone can agree on, unlike beauty and other things like that. So again, it seems like focusing on this instrumentality is a great way to start in developing a environmental ethic. And this comes to my main idea that the fact that nature has been so valuable instrumentally for such a long period of time, it seems that we should value it above and beyond just how it's instrumentally valuable for us right now. We should look at how it's provided for everything that we have really in the past and the present, and how it will continue to do so in the future. And when I was thinking about this, I was reminded of Socrates in Plato's Crito, where he's just been put in jail for running around the city and making claims about the gods and offending people in some way or another. And he's been sentenced to death unjustly by the court of Athens. And while he's in jail, his friend Crito comes and tells him that he should escape prison. Like, it was obviously an unjust ruling, so he should get out of there while he can. And he thinks the guard will just let him go, so it's like there's not really that much to risk. But Socrates tells Crito that this is not a good thing to do, because while the city may have harmed him right now, literally everything he owns and everything he's experienced, he owes to the city. He imagines, in defending his view, Socrates imagines what the city would be saying to him if he was going to try to escape, and he believes the city would say something like, "Did we not bring you to birth, and is it not through our rules and our regulations that we allowed your mother and father to be married and have you as a child?" And he imagines the city saying things like, "Your country is to be honored more than your mother, your father, and all your ancestors. It is to be more revered and more sacred, and you must worship it and yield to it." And the city and nature both seem kind of like similar entities to me. They're both abstract and are made up of a multitude of small parts, yet both deserve respect as a whole, like Socrates explains. Socrates realized that the city was so instrumentally valuable in his entire life, and because of this, he's developed a respect and really a feeling of piety towards it. And the city's value, it's risen beyond just caring about its instrumentality to actually caring about its well-being in some way. Socrates thinks that if he were to escape prison, it would give reasons for other people to escape prison, and just the whole fabric of the city could fall apart. So it seemed very similar to what I was thinking of in how we should view the environment. Viewing nature in the same way, respecting its long history and what it's done for us, and because of this respect, we should treat it as a single entity, as a single very valuable entity, and should not harm it in any way or try to break its rules or anything like that. And viewing nature in this way, in the same way that Socrates viewed the city, doesn't make any appeals to any meta-ethical claims or metaphysical ideas like intrinsic value or things that we can't really put our finger on. It just tells us to focus on how it's helped us in the past, and to realize that the fact that it has helped us so much is enough reason to respect it in a sophisticated and caring way. But unlike the city, which has strict rules and laws that Socrates felt like he should follow, nature is not really telling us how to act in a lot of cases. So we still have the problem of thinking about how we should act in relation to nature. Again, going back to Holmes Ralston III, he, in his book, Environmental Ethics, Duties to and Values in the Natural World, he speaks about how we should follow nature as a guide for how we should act in relation to it. And a quote that he says is, "What one needs is a nature where the evils are tributary to the goods, where natural resistance is embraced within and made intelligible by natural conductance, not death but life, including human life, fitted to this planetary environment, is the principal mystery that has come out of nature. For several billion years, the ongoing development and persistence of that life, culminating in human life, have been the principal features of eco-nature, behind which the element of struggle must be contained as a sub-theme. Our conduct ought to fit this natural life story." And I take this to mean that we should follow nature in the sense that we should not get in its way too much, really. We should understand the course of nature, past, present, and future, and we should act in ways that we feel like nature would approve of. Just like Socrates imagines what the city would say to him if he was going to try to escape prison, we should imagine what nature would say to us when we are about to do something. And this doesn't mean we can't cut down trees and build roads and like mine for resources and mountains and things like that. But we should be very careful of our actions and try to realize to the best of our ability all the consequences our decisions may have, making sure that nature maintains its natural course. So things like abusing animals in our surroundings, like pumping animals full of steroids and storing them in cramped and unnatural ways, and polluting the atmosphere, resulting in an increase in global temperature, both seem like unnatural and therefore unethical ways to interact with our surroundings and fellow animals. We should also develop a respect and appreciation for the instrumental value that nature has on other entities on Earth. So just because a mouse can't value its food doesn't mean that we shouldn't respect the mouse's right to food. And again, the same way, a baby human can't consciously value and express its need for milk, but we still feel like we have a duty to allow it to receive milk and care and things like that. So we should just the main idea behind this is that we should just do our best to really think about how other natural entities, other animals, and how the environment as a whole would view our actions if they had the same valuing capabilities that we have. We are by far the best and most sophisticated valuers on the earth, so it seems kind of like we have a duty to figure out what things have value, not only to ourselves but to other things, and then follow and then act accordingly to that description of value. Also, we have to understand it may be necessary to act in somewhat unnatural ways sometimes to protect nature as best we can. But this being said, it may be necessary to act in ways that may seem unnatural at times. Really, we've kind of gotten our hands in all the pies of nature, in that we've kind of affected the entire globe in many ways that we can't change back. So sometimes it's necessary to kind of try to fix our mistakes and save nature in certain ways. So doing things like relocating populations and certain animals in order to have a more balanced and normal and better functioning ecosystem might be necessary, even though that seems unnatural to do, to just pick up an entire species and move it to a different area. We understand that doing this will, as a whole, if nature were to look on us and doing something like that, it would understand. But really, this paper isn't meant to provide a strict code of ethics or a guide in every moral dilemma, but instead just to explore an idea that maybe instrumental value could lead or is sufficient in us establishing an environmental ethic. And we don't have to make appeals to intrinsic value, I don't feel like, in order to understand that nature is valuable and deserves our respect. I feel like a lot of times philosophers often have a derisive tone when talking about instrumental value, when comparing it to intrinsic value, thinking that it's somehow lower or less important. But really, this isn't clear to me either that that's true. Um, the nature's instrumental value and capacities in the thousands and thousands of years that it's been valuable to humans seems like it's more valuable than just arbitrarily assigning something something complex and metaphysical like intrinsic value to it. It's like we can look at the track record of nature and realize that it's earned through its instrumentality, it's earned this respect, and we don't have to add any other type of value at all, really. I don't believe. That's pretty much my whole paper, and I would like to say thanks again to Coastal Carolina University and the Jackson Family Center for Ethics and Values. And I was excited to film this, and I've enjoyed doing it, and I really am looking forward to hearing what people think and the comments that come, and also to looking at the other presentations. Thanks for watching and reading if you did read it, and have a good day.